When I began my research into deconversion, it was on the tail end of what was known as the New Atheist movement. During that time, people were leaving religion for a lot of reasons, but one of the primary reasons was that people wanted to have accurate beliefs. If Christianity was untrue, it was worthless, and everyone who left it to pursue truth elsewhere. But culture has shifted. Truth-seeking behavior has slid to a very low priority, as many people are beginning to embrace the idea that there is no such thing as absolute truth. There are personal truths, but there's no overarching truth. Now, my original model for deconversion might require a bit of rethinking. The primary driver for deconversion now is not the desire to believe true things, but rather the desire to reduce harm. Christianity isn't bad because it's unscientific, but rather it's bad because of political alignments and the kinds of values it advances or doesn't advance. The idea of spiritual abuse and religious trauma syndrome have been floating around for years now, but they've recently come to dominate the conversation, elbowing out discussions of scientific accuracy and magical thinking. And that's the subject of this video, the research surrounding spiritual abuse. The topic of spiritual abuse has been floating around in the cultural lexicon since at least 1991, when Johnson and Van Vondersen published their book, The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. However, the concept of spiritual abuse and related terms such as religious abuse, church hurt, and religious trauma syndrome have become increasingly visible within the culture, raising the question of whether churches are becoming more abusive, abuses within the churches are becoming more visible, or the culture is becoming increasingly sensitized towards the standards, teachings, and culture within Christianity, such that these aspects of religion have remained relatively consistent, but are increasingly out of line with cultural sensitivities. Because victims of spiritual religious abuse, which we'll call SRA, inevitably rely on their religious environments to inform their moral development, abuses performed within that environment have a necessary impact on the person's moral development. However, defining the period of emerging moral development most impacted by these abuses becomes a difficult task, given that the abuses are not constrained to a specific period in any given victim's life. Consequently, this lecture will focus on those who exit their religious environments in emerging adulthood and cite SRA as the motivating factor for their religious disaffiliation. The relationship between religion and psychology has been something of a roller coaster ride over the years. Early pioneers in psychology, such as Freud, James, and Skinner, tended to see religion as a product of psychological inclinations, indoctrinations, or behavioral proclivities. However, in treatment and therapy, the psychological institution gradually began to admit that spiritual beliefs and practices may have some beneficial outcomes in a person's mental health, and these practices became more accepted and in some instances encouraged within therapy. Researchers Cashwell and Swindle, 2018, even go so far as to say that religious abuse only occurs when religion is misused, suggesting that when properly exercised, religion is helpful rather than harmful. However, Nothing is ever black and white in nature, and as the psychology of religion has continued to be a field of interest, damaging or harmful aspects of religion have also begun to receive attention. In respect to this question, one group of researchers, Harris et al. 2007, accused the psychological community of a lack of nuance and creative thinking when it comes to the relationship between religion and mental health. They conclude their study by saying that the question is not whether religion is good or bad for mental health, but rather which aspects of religion are good and which are bad. The first task at hand is to define spiritual religious abuse, or SRA. Cashwell and Swindle, 2018, describe it as a form of betrayal trauma, meaning that the victim is placed his or her trust in the person or institution, and that person or institution violates the trust in a significant way. Because betrayal trauma is a kind of trauma which can occur within any kind of community of trust, this kind of trauma isn't unique to a religious community. But do religious communities operate in ways that are unique from any other type of community? This question matters, because Cashwell and Swindle tell us that the relationship between the betrayer and the betrayed are important factors to how the trauma is encoded and recalled by the individual. For instance, if the trauma occurs within a church environment, features of that environment, such as the music, messages, and iconography, may become traumatic by association. Cashwell and Swindle identify 3 categories of spiritual abuse. Those abuses which are perpetrated by religious leaders, such as emotional manipulation to contribute money. Abuses more broadly committed by a religious group or person representing that group, such as discriminating against specific demographics. Or those abuses which have some kind of religious component to them, such as using scripture to justify abusive behavior. Because of its rise in visibility, the concept of spiritual or religious abuse is receiving more attention from the psychological community, with a rise in related research within the last 10 years. There are some difficulties parsing through the data on SRI research. One difficulty is that the majority of the research in this area appears to have been performed by those who claim to be victims of such abuses, raising the question of a conflict of interest in the research itself. Perhaps worse than this, most individuals working in the field to give therapy and counseling to religious abuse survivors claim to themselves be victims of religious abuse. As a consequence, Ellis et al. 2022 report that the mental and emotional health of these therapists are at stake, with many reporting that their trauma responses and feelings have been heightened when exposed by proxy to the trauma of their clients. Another such difficulty is that SRA is defined in terms of known kinds of abuse. For instance, Cashwell and Swindle 2018 defined it as mental, physical, sexual, and or emotional abuse that occurs within a religious context or setting. This definition raises the question of whether religious abuse deserves its own special category of study, given that it is not a type of abuse unique from the already studied and categorized sorts of abuse. For instance, using one's status as a religious authority as a method of gaining access to a person in order to sexually victimize him or her. In such cases, the religious environment facilitated the abuse, but the question remains if such abuse can be said to be religious in addition to sexual in nature, or is it just sexual? To address this concern, Cashwell and Swindle suggest that given that religious beliefs and communities have such a unique and important mental health component to them, when an abuse occurs within that context, the person is cut off from the mental health benefits they were otherwise receiving from that environment. Additionally, when the religious component is included in the abuse, there is a potential of bringing the entire religious community into the scenario as either a facilitator of the abuse or failing to prevent the abuse, or as protecting the abuser. This fault-finding may extend beyond the religious community to God himself. This adds an existential layer to the abuse that would otherwise be absent. To quote Cashwell and Swindell, 2018, quote, "If the abuse is perceived as coming from God by someone who believes in an omnipotent God, there is nothing more powerful." A final difficulty with SRA research is that so much of it has been done in the form of qualitative study, and very few tools have been developed to measure SRA, and very little quantitative analysis devoted to this study. While the impact of SRA on women has been an ever-present theme throughout the literature, one aspect of SRA which is touched on at least peripherally in the majority of the research, with a significant amount of research devoted specifically to this factor alone, is SRA and individuals or communities with non-traditional sexual identities. This should not be particularly surprising, given that for most of their existence, the majority of traditional religions do not include the growing list of sexual identities now ubiquitous throughout the Western culture, and several major religions contain dogma against these identities and practices. However, more potently, the modern Western milieu asks one to ally oneself either with one's religion or one's sexual identity, placing the two in a position of opposing identities, and therefore incompatible. The rise of visibility and interest in SRA may be partially driven by increasing political tension in the United States. This is evidenced by the fact that when one searches for articles addressing religious trauma syndrome, one of the top 3 results is a study titled Traumatic Fundamentalist Childhood and Trump, Adams 2019. This article claims, in all seriousness, that American Christians were engaging in a purity campaign to cleanse America of all non-Christian elements. Page 158, Adams 2019. The article goes on to suggest that this is the political campaign of American Christian fundamentalists that resulted in the term religious trauma syndrome. As mentioned in the previous section on sexuality, those individuals who possess a non-traditional sexuality frequently feel pressured to choose between their religion or their sexuality, and this is exacerbated by the political climate in the West. Political factors may explain the rise in SRA visibility, but they don't explain the beginning of the term religious trauma syndrome, which actually began in the late 90s, published in a book by Marlene Wendell. This is either because political division is driving SRA, as Adams suggests, or because political interest is placing the Christian culture under academic scrutiny. For women, the research on spiritual abuse has centered around the issue of how religion has been used as a tool to victimize women in other ways. For instance, early research into new religious movements was able to discover that women who enter these novel or minority religious groups were frequently utilized for the sexuality. Jacobs, 1984. They were placed in highly traditional gender roles, wherein they were subservient to men. Frequently, leaders in the new religious movements would characterize the act of having sex with him as a spiritual privilege, and women would be used as a method to recruit new members to the religious movement through a technique known as flirty fishing, wherein the woman would be required to flirt with a potential recruit in order to incentivize them into joining. The result of this is that the women in these movements would confuse sexuality with spirituality, and those women, less attractive or interesting to men, would see themselves as less spiritual or worthy. The instances when the spiritual abuse occurred in a more traditional religious setting, such as in an evangelical Christian church, the research has also identified ways in which the religious environment has failed to support women when they were being abused in these other ways, or in some cases discouraged action which might allow them to escape abuse. In the work of Bent Goodley and Fowler, 2006, on African American women suffering domestic abuse, they found that these women frequently looked to their religious environment to provide support and encouragement. The solutions the church offered frequently consisted of asking the women to remain with the abusive partner, forgive the partner, and pray for change. Women began to feel discouragement, frustration, or even anger when God did not end their problem or deliver them from the situation. Cashwell and Swindle recommend, given that SRA is a form of betrayal trauma, that therapists deal with the religious abuse by being trauma-informed. Further, they recommend that the therapist familiarize him or herself with the details of the client's religious belief system. It is also important to avoid conflictive interests. In this case, that would mean that the therapist should be able to separate his or her personal beliefs from the experiences and treatment of the client. Given the nature of spiritual abuse, Cashwell and Swindle suggest that the first step in dealing with the problem is to help the client realize that the experience was abusive and traumatizing. Given its religious elements, there is the possibility that the person has identified the experience as part of the religious experience or an aspect of religious doctrine, and has therefore not identified the negative way in which it has impacted him or her mentally and emotionally. Most people who belong to religious communities benefit from the social acceptance and belonging that comes from having that community. Therapists are advised to encourage clients with SRA to seek out new communities which will fill those needs without subjecting them to the same kinds of experiences which led to their current trauma. Ellis et al., 2022, identified the most helpful factors in counseling related to SRA: social support, educational resources, changes in theological beliefs, religious attitudes and beliefs, spiritual practices, and value-driven behaviors. These treatments not only helped the individual recover from SRA, but also helped them to maintain their faith. In their literature review on the subject of SRA, Ellis et al., 2022, found that most studies on SRA interventions aimed at increasing awareness of SRA and the associated behaviors. This was done either through social media or by introducing it as a part of a spiritual leader's curriculum, say in a seminary. In the social media studies, increased knowledge of awareness of SRA was associated with reduced SRA behaviors in men, but not in women. This is possibly because the social media awareness campaigns portrayed men as the perpetrators of SRA and women as the victims. In the curriculum studies, participants began to advocate SRA awareness, but did not significantly decrease SRA behaviors. Researchers suggested this was because the clergy received the training and did not see themselves as perpetrators of SRA, and therefore made no changes to their personal behaviors. In a previous segment, I discussed the difficulties some victims have expressed in identifying their experience as traumatizing. One way in which this is done is the doctrine of sin. When a person behaves in a way contrary to the standards of religious community, the misbehavior is identified as a sin, and the person must then take the blame for the misbehavior on him or herself. The relationship between the doctrine of sin and trauma can be complicated. In some church environments, a heavy emphasis is placed on one's culpability and blame in a sin, leading to a pervasive sense of guilt or shame. Sin can also be used as a method of victim blaming, when a person is placed in a compromising position and then instructed to take the blame on him or herself as the sinner and guilty within that circumstance. Other religious environments, however, counter the emotionally damaging effects of a sin concept with doctrines such as grace and forgiveness, wherein the person is instructed not to take on the shame or guilt for their misbehavior, because the blame and guilt was divinely removed from them, and they remain blameless in a spiritual sense. Another religious doctrine or dogma associated with SRA is that of infallibility. Here I'm speaking not of biblical infallibility, but something closer to papal infallibility. That is, the idea that the spiritual leader is always in the right. This kind of freedom from blame or scrutiny is especially present in Catholic environments and in heavily Pentecostal environments, wherein the pastor assumes a more prophetic role, claiming to speak directly for God. This idea of infallibility of leadership is also common in new religious movements. The difficulty with this doctrine is that it tends to place the church, or the leader, above scrutiny, and when a person is victimized by either, the victim is seen as responsible for the circumstances of his or her victimization. This problem is outlined by Samuel Fernandez in his 2022 paper, Victims Are Not Guilty: Spiritual Abuse and Ecclesiastical Responsibility. Two other doctrines are linked to SRA by Einkenschein, 2019. One of these is Satan, who under particular church cultures becomes something of a boogeyman, a malevolent force blamed for crises and catastrophes, and someone to be on high alert for, creating a floating anxiety for believers in those environments. Another of these concepts is the rapture. This idea that at any moment without warning all believers will suddenly disappear might be fine if the person believes that he or she will disappear along with all the others. However, in some church environments, the ideas of being left behind is impressed onto the members in a sort of warning or cautionary measure to remain devout. This idea of being left behind while all the people one knows and loves or disappear has also instilled anxiety. When a person exits a religious community for any reason, whether it's abuse-related or otherwise, the relationship between the person and the religious community is necessarily changed, most especially by losing membership and acceptance within that community. The loss of community and the ensuing identity crisis are themselves traumatic. Specifically, these involve feelings of grief and loss. As a result, religious exiters frequently experience a form of religious trauma, even if that trauma was not present prior to their exit. Downey, 2022, suggests that religious trauma is far more prevalent than the literature suggests, and ought to become the subject of far more academic attention than it currently receives. In her essay on the topic, Ramler, 2023, offers her own experience of religious trauma, deconversion, and the fallout following this event as evidence of the need for further work in the field, and calls for an expansion of the rhetoric related to the concept of religious trauma. Downey's work on religious trauma was done in the form of a literature review, and, like Ramler, draws something on her own experiences. While Ramler suggests a radical shift in the rhetoric surrounding trauma psychology to include religion as a source of trauma, Downey simply suggests caution in terminology used by academics to categorize the phenomena. Up to this point, I've been using the acronym SRA for spiritual religious abuse. Downey suggests the researchers frame the problem in terms of religion rather than spiritual. Religion, although somewhat fluid of a term, still has the potential to be more measurable and empirical than the word spiritual. Downey suggests that religious trauma is categorized by a gradual building as specific religious ideas are internalized. She identifies the period of time at which people are most susceptible to these ideas as youth or early childhood. Further, Downey suggests that one characteristic of religious ideas, which is liable to traumatize, involves the breaking things into binary categories of good and bad, with all of the things in the bad category being roundly condemned. She says that this can affect a person in two realms. The emotional realm, with feelings of guilt, anxiety, and depression, and in the realm of the intellect, resulting in poorly nuanced black and white thinking and a loss of creativity. Helpfully, Downey identifies the functional conditions of an environment leading to religious trauma. Specifically, any environment which places things in rigid binaries, absolutes, and reactionary or proactive condemnatory attitudes. Presumably, any environment containing these features would lead to religious trauma, even if the environment isn't specifically centered around spiritual ideas. In a complementary finding, Harris et al., 2007, cite research that some religious environments are statistically associated with elevated well-being across a variety of metrics, whereas other types of religious environments are statistically associated with higher levels of mental illness, especially those they describe as more religious. More religious, for Harris et al., may map onto the condemnatory binary thinking identified by Downey. Harris et al. Did their study on the two outcomes religious functioning may have in relationship to trauma: recovery and growth on the one hand, and further traumatization on the other. When a person experiences trauma as a response to religious functioning, notes Harris et al., this will frequently result in the person exiting the religious environment entirely. This is reinforced by the essay by Ramler, whose experience of trauma, discovering that her youth pastor had been sexually assaulting her peers, eventually led her to her own exit from the church. Downey argues that this environmental trauma is liable to shape the person's nervous system and views such that exiting the religious environment would not remove the effects of the trauma from the person's life, and they would continue to experience the world through the lens of that trauma. These effects, says Downey, may potentially be lifelong. More than mere neurology, Downey suggests that if a person's way of knowing or understanding the world around him or her is done through a religious lens, which limits the person's ability to recognize circumstances in which he or she has been harmed, then the person could continue to undergo actual abuses without recognizing them as abuse, such as being shamed or belittled when one is taught one deserves shame or belittling for spiritual reasons. This is similar to the findings of Harris et al., 2007, that when one identifies trauma as direct judgment from God or as coming from the devil, this results in negative coping. This religion as a way of knowing critique is echoed in the essay of Ramler, who identified in her own deconversion that the religious lens through which she was been taught to view the world resulted in epistemic uncertainty, meaning she did not know how to understand the world outside of the religious context in which she was raised. Downey does acknowledge, however, what has been long recognized by psychologists since the turn of the century, that religion has potentially positive psychological benefits. Similarly, Harris et al. Acknowledged that religion has been shown to be an effective method of overcoming trauma and regaining mental and emotional stability on the other side. But Downey argues the mode in which religion is practiced could result in harmful thinking if one uses one's religious thinking to deny or bypass problems rather than find resolution or peace in the face of difficulty. This is complicated by the work of Harris et al., which suggests that prayers which defer or bypass trauma can lead to negative coping. Downey describes that shame is a bodily rather than mental experience. Further, Downey recognizes that shame can be an effective and non-damaging method of shaping behavior within the context of a secure relationship, as when a parent calls attention to a child's destructive behavior and the child feels shame, recognizing that she ought to have behaved differently. But within the context of an insecure relationship, as with a church environment which might ostracize a person of whom they disapprove, shame can be traumatizing and emotionally harmful. Because shame is physiological rather than psychological, once a person has been conditioned by one's religious environment to feel shame, those feelings may perpetuate outside of the religious environment. Downey suggests that the theme of guilt is built into Christian theology. Guilt, in this context, is defined as being responsible for wrongdoing. However, in certain religious environments, the concept of guilt, a volitional category, has been entangled with the concept of shame, an emotional category, such that Christian theology becomes inherently shame-inducing under this approach. Harris et al. Similarly identify guilt associated with failures in virtue as one of their 5 negative aspects of religious involvement. They noted that those aspects were associated with higher levels of depression and suicidality. Downey resolves the problem by concluding that the treatment for religious abuse through shame is to use religion to create something new and different in place of shame, and suggests that theologians take the research on religious abuse into account as they develop their discipline. Harris et al. Did their research on the interaction between a person's religion and that person's experience of trauma. This does not necessarily refer to trauma experienced within a religious context, but trauma in general. One such interaction is the cognitive dissonance one experiences when one cannot reconcile one's experience of trauma with the idea of a good, loving, and benevolent God. Harris et al. Identified 10 religious coping strategies which could be classified as positive in terms of overcoming trauma and building resilience, and 6 strategies associated with negative outcomes. The negative strategies include reduced satisfaction in one's relationship with God, the clergy, or one's faith group, attribution of stressors to Satan, an external loss of control, meaning waiting for God to fix the problem, identifying God as less than omnipotent, identifying the problem as direct punishment from God, and praying for a miracle or intercession. Harris et al. Found that individuals experiencing the negative effects of religious coping were more likely to seek out psychological solutions, such as counseling or therapy. The research of Harris et al. Was quantitative study with a sample of 327 participants, who were administered a battery of questionnaires related to trauma and religious coping. What they found was that there were 2 post-traumatic paths one could pursue in relationship to one's religion, with the one, seeking spiritual support, related to post-traumatic growth, although not a reduction of post-traumatic symptoms, and the other, religious strain, related to post-traumatic symptoms, but not related, positive or negatively, to post-traumatic growth.